Good afternoon, and welcome to the third edition of Western Michigan University Cooley Law School's Community Conversation Series. I am Paul Zelensky and will be your facilitator for this hour-long conversation. This week's WMU-Cooley conversation topic is civil rights and how it relates to current events. I see that our president and dean, James McGrath, is with us today, and he'd like to give a special welcome.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to everybody who's here today. I know you have very busy lives and you could be doing a number of different things. So we're glad you're here with us today for this very important talk. I think you're going to be very pleased. Professor Brame speaks, I would love to say, all over the world, and I can, because he actually does interviews in many different countries, as well as all over our great country. So you're in for a treat. Thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it back to Paul to introduce Professor Brame.
Thank you very much. Associate Dean and Professor Tracey Brame is our special guest today. She will have some initial comments, and then we're going to get into hopefully a pretty active question and answer period and have a conversation. We ask that you submit your questions in the chat on the screen that you see before you. You know, these past couple of weeks, our news feeds have switched from predominantly the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, to the homicide of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the events that have followed. Both the pandemic and Mr. Floyd's death disproportionately impacted or continue to impact our Black communities and are challenging our civil rights laws for equal access and treatment, whether it be from the health system or the police. We have seen protests and demonstrations by people of all races challenging two fundamental rights in our society, healthcare and public safety. We are so fortunate to have Professor Brame, a civil rights expert, to help us sort through all of this to the extent that we can. You can read more about Professor Brame at the WMU-Cooley website, and we will post her bio in the chat. Now, this conversation will only be as good and helpful if you are active participants. Again, encourage you to put your questions in the chat. So let's get to it. Professor Brame, thank you for being here today. You know, this past week, you were quoted in U.S. News and World Report that the current protest triggered by Mr. Floyd's, quote, feels different from other police-related deaths. Let's start the conversation there. Why does it feel different?
Good afternoon, Paul, and thank you everyone for coming in. And I do want to start by saying I appreciate you taking your time to have this really important conversation this afternoon. I want to echo Paul's sentiments. Please list questions in the chat, because anyone who knows me knows that I can talk as long as you'll let me. So please, interrupt anytime in the chat with questions. I would love to hear from you. So why is this different? Or I guess, is this different? That a lot over the last couple of weeks. And I've been around for a few decades now, and unfortunately have some experience, at least, both as a bystander and an advocate for these types of issues. And I want to say, I truly believe I want this time to be different. Of course, in many ways, it seems all too much the same, right? The list of African-American men killed in police encounters is far too long. It struck me that I actually, when this last incident happened with George Floyd, I decided to make a statement and wear my appropriate statement shirt. And I actually pulled out my I Can't Breathe shirt from 2014 when Eric Garner was killed, just to show you, again, how cyclical, unfortunately, right, this has become. So like I said, in too many ways, it feels the same. One of the things that encourages me, though, and one of the things that I hope is different this time, I guess are a few things. First, I have personally seen support and, just broadly seen support from just all four corners of the earth, just a broad range of support from people of different backgrounds, from people in different countries. I have actually heard from folks on this that I never would have thought, right, would have shared my perspective on it, and it's been very refreshing. Like Dean McGrath said, I've had interviews in Australia, not in Australia right now. I'm not going anywhere right now, right? But I've interviewed with folks in Australia. I was just on the phone with someone in Seattle. I've talked to someone in Japan. People are really, really interested in this, and they, kind of really want to know what's going on in the U.S., right? And how can we change? So that's been encouraging. Another thing that I've seen that I have not seen in the past is relatively swift action, right? So the officers in the George Floyd incident were immediately let go, and then charges followed, and then charges were upped, and everyone was charged, and so now we're going to see that play out in the justice system. We see, police officers and police organizations and, chiefs and things standing in solidarity with protesters, agreeing that something has to change. Right. So like I said, all of that has been encouraging. And so people ask, well, why is this different? Right. I was trying to list, the number of people just in the last 5 or 6 years who suffered similar fates. And, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, just again, and that's just, an abbreviated list. Why does this feel different? And I think there are kind of two primary reasons. One is, like you mentioned before, we're kind of in the midst of two pandemics, right? So for the last 3 months, I think the world has seen kind of life kind of pile on in the Black community, if you will. So shortly after the COVID pandemic, once we realized, right, the crisis that was at hand, shortly thereafter it became apparent that it was impacting Black communities, right, more than any other community. I have my parents are 70 years old and they live in Detroit, and I have ordered them to shelter in place until 2021, right, because they lived in a hot spot, and they're right at the age, and unfortunately, right, of the racial background that put them at risk, right? So around then I had a round of interviews. Why is this impacting the Black community so much? Underlying conditions, poverty, lesser access to healthcare, et cetera. And then right behind that, so we're talking about George Floyd, and I'll get to why I think he was so impactful. But just in the last month before George Floyd, right, we had the killing of Ahmaud Arbery at the hands of 2 white citizens trying to make an arrest because they thought that he was suspicious, that he had done something criminal. And then in between, we had Christian Cooper, who was minding his business in Central Park and asked someone to leash their dog, and she proceeded to threaten to call the police and tell them. First, she told him, "I'm going to call the police and tell them that a Black man is threatening me." And she said that because she knew, right, the import of that. She knew that would threaten him. She knew that would intimidate him, and she knew if she called the police, she'd get a response, right? And then, of course, Memorial Day, we saw the terrible encounter between George Floyd and Minneapolis police. And, that encounter was, I think, the proverbial straw in the sense that, again, we've been seeing all these things going over the last few months, and it was so visible and so horrible, right? I liken it to an Emmett Till moment. I don't, those who remember during the civil rights movement, there was a young man, my son's age, who was brutally murdered by a couple of white men because he supposedly whistled at a white woman. And his mother, at his funeral, Emmett Till's mother, decided to leave his casket open at the funeral because she wanted the world to see what had happened to her son. And it was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, right? Because it was visual evidence that, the struggle, the oppression, the terror that African Americans were going through was real, right? It wasn't made up. And this incident to me was reminiscent of that in the sense that, I can't think of anyone who could watch George Floyd's last moments, right? And not feel for him. Right, not feel for his family, not feel how horrible this was. At the end of my class this week, I teach a class on race in the Supreme Court, and I voluntarily at the very end, I asked all who wanted to stay and kind of sit in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. They could do so, and we did, and it was very uncomfortable. It was a long time. The New York Times put together a montage of video footage of the last half hour of George Floyd's life, just from the time he exited the store the first time to the time that he took his last breath. And it was, again, I could barely get through it, without just dissolving in a pool of tears. And so I think, again, the very visual nature of that could not help but to touch people. We often hear cries for the other side, and we want to understand that what the officers must have been thinking, and maybe they were afraid, but it was hard to look at this incident and find the other side, right? and I see in the chat, one of my IP students pointed out correctly that the woman involved in the Emmett Till case came out a couple of years ago. She's older now, of course, and said that Emmett Till, of course, did not do what he was accused of. Not that that should have cost him his life anyway, but you're absolutely right, Gabrielle. See, I love our students on it, so anyway, I think, right, that's in part why this is different, right? There's certainly a sense in the Black community that something has to change, and we just can't keep going through this over and over again. But there's also a sense, I think, in the human, right, the global human community that this just isn't right. Other question I've been asked a lot lately is, why does this keep happening, right? So we find ourselves here again and again. And we have conversations. There's protests, of course. There was Ferguson. When I was a college student, right? When I was a college student at the University of Michigan, there were riots in LA, right? Because Rodney King was assaulted and beaten, and the officers who were charged with it were acquitted. And there was protests back then, and we seem to find ourselves here once again. And why is that? So, I certainly came to talk about the legal perspective, and we can talk about that. But I have a broader, I think, sense of at least why I think this keeps happening. So again, I teach a class called Race in the Supreme Court, and over the course of the class, we come back again and again to the theme of, right, the power of the law contrasted with the limits of the law, right? What the law can do, right, but where its power stops, right, and humanity has to take over. And I think that racial justice in our country is a glaring example of that, right? So I'm going to go way back, right? So we started in my class. We start back, on the shores of our continent, way back during the days of our country's founding. And when I talk about racial oppression and racial justice and things like that, people ask me, well, are you a patriot? Like, do you do you celebrate the 4th of July? Do you? And I said, oh, are you kidding me? Right. I love this country. I have a ton of respect for this country, if for no other reason. I'm just a history buff. And the fact that a ragtag group of people, right, left their country and came over here to start a new one, right, and it's still, right, we're still at it, I think is incredible. Right, and amazing, and that the founders created this document that's been able to grow with us, but it has had to grow, and it had to grow for a reason. So the country was founded, and the founding documents of this country are some of the most beautiful, contain some of the most beautiful words ever written. Right, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? And that all of us are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I don't know that more beautiful words have ever been written. And I have a lot of respect again for the men who wrote them. But immediately our founders faced a tension between, right, what they had written and truly believed. I think they had a sense of what they thought freedom meant to them and how they lived their lives. Right. So these same men who wrote these beautiful words, right, didn't allow women to vote, right? These same men who wrote these beautiful words owned other people, right? Owned slaves, supported the kidnapping of people from their homeland to come over here and work under horrific conditions. And again, right, almost immediately that was a hypocrisy that had to be addressed. And so over time, because, as anybody here knows, race is a made up construct. There's no difference between me and anybody else, no inherent difference just because my skin is a little darker because I have a tan or what have you. Instead, it's something that was thrust upon us, right, to justify the horrors of slavery, right? Because originally people, like I said, our founders had to justify to other folks of the world, right? And I think to themselves how they could treat, right, these kidnapped Africans so differently, right, than they treated themselves. And what they came up with was, well, you know what, they're a little bit different, right? I know we said all men are created equal, but those Africans, they're a little savage. They're not quite as bright as we are. And the Bible says that they're supposed to be our servants, right? So this is right in line, right, with our virtues. This is just the way the world works, right? It's sad, it's pitiful for them, but it's the way the world works. And you would think that's antiquated thought, old school. Nobody thinks like that anymore. But I think you'd be surprised, right, how powerful words are, particularly when they're used in a way to, over the course of decades and generations, right, justify racial oppression, right? So those words ended up, right, not just in conversation, right, but even at the Constitutional Convention, again, when we're trying to keep the country together, right? When you have these colonies trying to come up with a plan, right, that they could come together, be a union, right, and start a country. Even then, there's this tension. What do we do, right, with this issue of slavery? And they didn't quite know, and they couldn't quite take a stand on it at the time because they felt like they had to save the union. And people could debate whether that was true or not. And so instead, right, they implemented these compromises at the time, that Black people would only be considered 3/5 a person, right? That, okay, we won't prohibit the importation of slaves until at least, for another 20 years or so. And if a slave escapes, you gotta send them back, right? These are things that, right, were in our Constitution. And again, at the time, they were considered compromises. And if you talk to people who didn't necessarily agree with slavery, they would tell you it was something that we had to do at the time. And I believe that there were people who thought that this was going to become a non-issue in a few years, right? We'll punt this down the line. Right? By 1808, people won't have a real taste for this anymore, and it'll go away. And of course, as we know, it didn't happen, right? It didn't happen. So you started to see cases, you started to see legislation pop up that included these justifications, right? So maybe a slave was killed by her slave owner, right? And you start to see cases that say, oh yeah, he can't be prosecuted for that, right? Slaves don't, right, any value of life that we have to respect, because if they did, what would happen? We can't make them believe that they're equal, right? And certainly that happened in slave states, but even in the North, right? There was a case in Connecticut where a woman was prosecuted for for boarding young African-American students from other states, so that, so they can get an education. And this was in the North in the 1800s. And Connecticut had a statute that said, you can educate Black people to live here, but you can't import people from other states, right, and do that without permission. And she didn't have permission. And when she was prosecuted, she was like, they tried to use the privileges and immunity clause. Her lawyer, relied on the Constitution and said, these students from New York have every right to an education in Connecticut, just like Connecticut citizens did. And the court's response was that Black people can't be citizens, right? They were never intended to be citizens. And these were not slaves. These were free Black people who were coming to Connecticut to be educated, right? And again, I know it sounds like ancient history, but like I said, it all builds up to what we see today. And then, of course, most people are familiar with infamous cases like Dred Scott and Francis Ferguson, where even our Supreme Court, right, made it clear at a point in our country that Black citizens Black people did not have any rights that white people had to respect, right, and couldn't be citizens. So, and then you think about the fact that, of course, the law, right, again, talking about the power of the law and the limits of the law, we eventually evolved from a legal standpoint, right? So in 1954, we at least got to the point in Brown versus Board of Education, where we had our Supreme Court recognizing that de jure segregation is harmful, right, and wrong. That was less than 100 years ago, right? You finally got our court to say, it's not a crime for a Black woman to marry a white man. That was less than 100 years ago. Right? You finally have a Civil Rights Act that actually, right, codifies, right, the 15th Amendment. That was less than 100 years ago. And I think, and I really believe, and I see there's questions in the chat and I want to get to them, so I'll end this piece by saying this. So I really believe that one of the things that we have to do, right? So you would see in these cases sometimes, particularly segregation cases, the court would say, I get what you're saying. You don't want to separate races, and it doesn't seem fair. But what do you want us to do? What do you want the court to do? Right? The courts can't legislate morality. The court can't make white people want to sit next to Black people. Sorry, we would if we could, but that's more of a social issue. And of course, that was an attempt to punt. That was an attempt to push the issue to the legislature, to somebody else. But there was some truth in that, in the sense that, right, we ended up with all kinds of laws that prevent de jure segregation, and yet, right, our inner cities are still some of the most segregated, right, places in the world, right? We integrated schools, And yet there are educational disparities, right, in just about any inner city community in the country. And so, there we get to the limit, right, of the law. And again, I'll answer questions in this by saying, in order to really move forward, right, in order to, in my opinion, to give breath, right, true breath to the laws that were passed and these beautiful opinions and legislations of the last 100 years, we as a country have to truly reckon with our history, right? We have to truly know where we came from, know the history of African and African Americans in this country, know what happened to them, really face it, realize, and this is key to me, realize that it's not some horrible thing that's from the past, right? But that it was several generations ago, but that the echoes of it have reverberated right to this point. We have to actually make that link, right, between the terrorism that occurred during slavery, during Jim Crow, right, during the incident with George Floyd, make that link, right, to other barriers that all of us as African Americans face, and really talk about that, and not run away from that and just say, oh, no, there's a law that applies to that. You guys just apply it.
Right. Dean Brame, you mentioned the metaphor of punting, by our founders, and then subsequently, and we've, in the sense of continue to punt, somehow it's going to magically get better. Do you think with the George Floyd situation, his homicide, that maybe the ball has been caught and they're starting to run upfield a little bit, to continue with the metaphor? In terms of it feeling different, what's your thought on that?
I do. I hope so. Again, like we discussed earlier, I hope so. I think that hopefully this was a bridge too far for even, right, those who, were wary of diving into these issues before. I really hope so. I tell you though, I was just talking to some students this week who talk about, particularly their parents, really wanting this to be different, but being afraid to hope so. Right, like being afraid to actually believe that this is going to be the time that changes. So, one person I was talking to, a radio interviewer, kind of asked me the same question, and I said, you know what? Let's see what we're talking about in June of 2021.
Right, give it time.
And he said, I'm going to have you back next year. I said, we'll see, right, if we're still kind of talking about this issue and what we can do, right, because the protesters eventually, right, the protests will die down, and George Floyd's family will move on, and we'll have some congressional hearings, et cetera. But what will we be talking about next year?
Okay. So Amanita Kamara asked an insightful question, and I recently saw, I want to say, a post or something about what can we do to stop the police brutality as it is happening. And I believe there was a police chief that came out that they're working on some technology where they could intervene while the inappropriate behavior is occurring, to correct behavior while it's occurring. So in this case, when the police officer had his knee on the neck, and allegedly the other officer saying, do you want me to cuff him, or whatever the conversation was, if it was seen in real time, could there have been a minute change there? So do you see a possibility where in real time inappropriate behaviors could be, at least on the behalf of police, could be stopped before it gets to the point where it happened with George Floyd?
Well, I would hope, because one of the dynamics I saw in this case were that the fellow officers seemed kind of more paralyzed and complicit, right? Like, didn't seem to feel as though they were in a position. And I think I heard that one of the officers asked a couple of times, should we roll him over? And, Chauvin insisted no. I think that if other officers were empowered, right, or even required, right, to intervene when they saw something like that going on, that could go a long way, right, to change the culture from a kind of go along, with what's going on, to really intervene, meaning to stopping inappropriate behavior. I think that would be certainly a step in the right direction. Certainly a step in the right direction.
Go ahead.
And just to comment off of that, I know that officers did ask to roll him over, but there were also citizens that were literally telling him to get off of him when he was no longer moving, because after the ambulance came, they were still on his neck for another minute, I believe it was. So when I'm asking that question, not just as a law student, but me as a citizen of this country, it's like, what else can we do to stop this from happening? It's the police.
Right, exactly.
Easier said than done.
Right, right. What that's your rock and hard place. Where are you at? I mean, you're right. Particularly the New York Times video footage shows that there were bystanders imploring Chauvin, right, to leave him alone. He can't breathe. He can't move. He's not moving, right? And if that doesn't stop it, kind of what will? What will? And that's the $4,000 question.
Then that begs the question about the debate going on about defunding police. And you see a variety of responses that we're getting from a variety of communities. What are your thoughts about completely overhauling the police effort, defunding? Explain what that means, because I think some people don't understand particularly what that means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I know some people think, and intuitively you would say, why would you take money from the police department, right? Like we need law enforcement and, we need people to protect and serve, et cetera. But again, I think the notion, and you use the right word, I think, is overhaul, even to the extent that let's scratch this and start over. My colleague, Tanya Cross-Phelan, talks a lot about kind of the evolution of the militarization of police and the relationship between police and communities devolving over the last couple of decades to this antagonistic as opposed to supportive relationship. And so I think that the move to defund or to reallocate resources, right, within the police department is more about taking resources from that piece of it, right, from that combative piece of it, from that new armored tank or whatever, like whatever they're rolled into communities, and maybe reallocate it to more proactive or preventive measures, right, to mental health services, to educational services, to things that will prevent these interactions in the first place. And, right, also perhaps to training of officers. A student said this week, and I thought that it was really interesting that, we as lawyers, we have to pass a character fitness test in order to practice law, right? We have to be deemed by a committee, right, to be fit to enter practice, no matter how well we do on our tests and no matter what our score on the bar exam. Should there and how can there be similar standards, right, for police officers before, they're being put on the streets? And so, and I've seen, again, I've been around long enough. I'll be 50 this year, and I've been around long enough to kind of see this ebb and flow. When I was a kid, my brother played for the police athletically. He played football, and I had officers coming to school to tell us to say no to drugs, et cetera. So this idea of community policing and police departments partnering with communities is not new. But again, the war on drugs and the overrepresentation of Black people in general in the criminal justice system have, just kind of led to this beefing up of departments over the last, 20, 30 years. That again has led to the combative nature of relationships. And so, yeah, again, I think people are ready for an overhaul. So we can't. This is not working. Right.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Conklin brings up the whole issue around qualified immunity for police officers, which is a good one, and he wanted to take more of a legal standpoint from a civil rights, and what does it look like from a civil rights qualified immunity? What does it look like as a win for societies from a legal standpoint?
Right. So as we know, in general, like, other officials, officers often have qualified immunity in suits. And, again, I have a lot of respect for what the police do, and they have to have, some kind of parameters within which they can work to do their very dangerous jobs. And by the nature of their jobs, they have to use discretion, and sometimes they get it wrong, et cetera. So I understand the foundations, right, the underlying foundations of qualified immunity. But, right, when you continue to have issues like this, if you can get to a place where you can pierce it, at least to the extent that, right, that you can, prove that a certain officer or either that a certain incident had racial overtones or that a certain officer had a history, right, of violent confrontations, which I believe this officer did. And that issue actually is, right, being brought up more in reports. And probably will get, again, another outgrowth of this incident. Others will get more of a review. So there has to be a balance between, giving police officers a space to do their job, right, which is valid, but not letting officers and departments hide behind the cloak of qualified immunity to excuse, inappropriate and violent behavior. So.
Right, and I believe recently a mayor of a major city says that he's not going to negotiate with police unions at this point. And and I think the person may have been a Democrat, if I have my news right. I'm conflating a bunch of different things here, but what role do the unions play here with the police unions play in getting us to a better place.
Right, and so the unions, again, by their nature, they represent and they defend their officers as appropriate. And I think, you know, one of the dynamics in Minneapolis was that Minneapolis had started to move toward this kind of warrior style police training, and then the mayor outlawed it, and the police union wanted to do it anyway, et cetera. You know, again, we've seen police chiefs kneeling with protesters. You know, we've seen other officers kind of come out and support. And again, you know, and this is where I think humanity comes in. If we can get a step past this us versus them, because I think, you know, the unions their knee-jerk reaction is going to be to protect. You know, I saw an officer give a press conference a couple of days ago, and he was, you know, he was so upset, and he was like, you know, you're vilifying all of us, and we're not all him, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the comments were like, yeah, you see how we feel every day, right? You know what I mean? Like, you know, you're just 2 weeks in, and you're having a fit, right? You know, so right, but you know, I know that the unions feel put upon because, you know, the Derek Chavins of the world do, right, make cops look bad. But again, I think that we're going to have to, at some point, be at the same table, you know, working under the same premises in order to actually move forward. And that's why I keep coming back to conversations and real conversations. Because again, I know that sounds trite, and people say, well, we talked and talked, and you can't really get anywhere. But I think we talk to a point, right? I think we make our points, right? And then that stops. We're intractable in our, you know, the police are racist and this is never going to change. And the police are like, we're misunderstood and this is never going to change. And if we can actually get, you know, to a point, whether it be unions or whomever, where you can actually listen to the voices of the community and you know, kind of come together for solutions.
Yeah, Gabriel Clark brings up a similar kind of a related issue is community involvement in hiring of police officers.
Exactly.
Which could be a fundamental change within large and small communities across the country.
Exactly. So for example, here in Grand Rapids, you know, we have police community relations boards. We have a board that hears complaints about the police. But in this last round of hiring for our police chief, there was actually, you know, community involvement in hiring Officer Payne, and he's an African-American officer who's been around Grand Rapids for a long time. And there was a concerted effort, right, to you know, not just go, you know, outside and you know, find somebody with whatever experience, but to actually listen to the community. And so I think that's an important aspect of getting buy-in, right? Because I think, you know, there has to be trust on both sides. And every time something like this happens, that trust is eroded, you know what I mean? And one of the ways to rebuild that trust is to give the community buy-in and what the true, right, a true seat at the table and true buy-in about what happens next.
We started the conversation about asking you about what's different this time around, and one of the things you pointed out was swift action by the justice system. It seemed relatively swift action by the justice system. Do you think because we're in a health-related pandemic, and kind of you also mentioned the escalation of the kind of people's impatience with things right now, and almost immediately saw people taking to the streets, right? Are these two somehow, would this have happened, the results that were maybe, and why it might be different because of the George Floyd incident, would have been the same if the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't in play, do you think?
That's a great question. You know, again, you know, the worldwide attention on this particular issue, I think would have been similar because again, it was just so vivid. But I do think, you know, so for example, in Grand Rapids, the first night that there were protests, you know, there were a variety of people outside, and there was a very peaceful protest for the first couple of hours, and then it kind of went left toward the, you know, later in the evening, and there was, you know, some destruction of property, et cetera. And I've heard, you know, mentioned that part of that, right? Part of that was pent up, you know what, we've been in the house for, you know, for 3 months and just being impatient in general. But regarding the swift action with respect to the firing, you know, and charging of the police officers, I think that, you know, is unrelated. I think again, I think again, authorities moved quickly, maybe to try to stave off, right, some of the protests, but also because again, you know, it was just so clearly wrong. But we'll see what the charges. They've been swift to charge, but you know, like I said, as we saw, as I saw in 1992, they also charged the officers who beat Rodney King. So we'll see kind of what happens in a few months. But they were swift to try to hold them accountable.
And news sources are reporting the last couple of days that there was some plea negotiations that fell through. What do you think happened there?
So, I think they're trying to get the officers to, cooperate or roll, or on one another. Trying to, because there's four of them. And essentially that, that kind of happens in any criminal case, right? You try to build your case, you try to, see if you can get cooperating witnesses who are on the scene that can buttress your case against your main guy, right? That's always preferable. And so, I would imagine they might have offered lesser charges to some of the quote unquote less culpable officers, but that's tricky. Because any kind of plea and any kind of convictions have implications, for the officers. I'm sure that the union is, talking to them about implications of that kind of thing.
Gabriel also brings up an interesting point of we live in an age where body cameras, cell phone cameras, all those kinds of things that didn't exist perhaps in the last really significant civil unrest occurred around race. Play the role, if you could comment on the role of technology generally that can play and will play in the future of having a more just society.
Absolutely. So, I mentioned earlier, just the technology of having pictures, in the 60s, not only Emmett Till's funeral, but just the pictures of the protesters being hosed, et cetera, marked a sea change, I think, in the civil rights movement. Similarly, I think the combination of the technology, the video technology, but also social media, of course, it's a double-edged sword. Social media can tend to divide us and we can hide behind anonymity and say crazy stuff. But, right, it can also light a fire, right, when things like this happen. So because a lot of police officers have body cams and things like that now, but not only that, there were bystanders that were, literally standing there recording the whole thing so that the country and the world got to see it in real time, right, which is impactful. And then social media has played a great role in galvanizing people and organizing people for the protests and disseminating information, putting pressure on officials, to do things, et cetera. So I think that things move more swiftly, right? When you have all of this happening in real time. There's no time for people to try to gather and get their stories straight, right? Because you can see what happened in real time, just like in Buffalo, where that older gentleman was shoved to the ground, and the first story was he tripped, and it's like, no, the video kind of shows that somebody pushed him down to the ground, right? So it's just harder to obfuscate if you have real time.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, the other day I saw another run of the Christian Cooper interaction in Central Park, and the white woman's reaction to kind of a seemingly innocuous kind of a situation, and me being a white male, you being a black female, and we reversed the situation, and you were the one calling the police on me. Why aren't we at that point yet?
Right. And it's because, again, from what I was talking about before, this kind of demonization of Black people and particularly Black men is real, right? Like, it's real. And I thought that Christian Cooper incident was just, really shined a light on that, because, again, she knew how powerful her words were, because, people are afraid of Black men for no apparent reason, except that whether consciously or unconsciously, right, they have these images in their mind that somehow, we as Black people are more dangerous or more criminal, et cetera. I tell people all the time, my husband is an executive at a company, right? Like he's number 2 at Cascade Engineering in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we can't get kind of more middle class, have a travel soccer player and and all, right? You can't get more middle class. And my husband, if he sees a police car behind him, he gets white knuckled, because he knows that if he gets stopped, they're not going to assume that he is an executive at a company, They're going to assume he's a big guy too. He played American football and I say American football because I have soccer players, so I got to differentiate. But he played football in college, and so he's a big guy. And for him to have to be afraid of that, right? I don't know, just shows you that we have not come far enough in that regard, with respect to human life.
He's still on mute, I believe.
I can hear you, just upset.
Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry about that. my friends, my male friends who are black, and they've been pulled over, for no apparent reason, and you try to get inside their head, and maybe this is just them, my weird friends, but they just kind of like tense up and they just don't want to talk about it. Do you have any sense of, help us understand what that's about?
It's tough. I tell my kids, so I have my son will be 14 next month. And I think, my daughter actually talks about all this more than he does. And I see him trying to process it all. I heard a student say the other day, and this has stuck with me for the last couple of days. He said, as Black men, right, in order to do what we have to do day to day, we have to tuck that stuff in, right? Like there's no way that we can truly go about our day and do what we need to do if we thought too hard about that kind of stuff, right? Like I said, my husband has, whatever, HR stuff to do, whatever he has to do at work. Our students, right? Our students, if you think about, our African-American students, they not only have to make sure they've gotten their homework done and they're ready for their assessments and they're getting ready for the bar, right? But then they have things like this happen in the middle of their semester and they have to somehow figure out how to process that. And so sometimes I think people find it easier, right, to not think that hard about it. I always say, I think every person of color, and really any underrepresented person, anybody with a complicated, right, relationship to American society. But I know me as a person of color, my husband, my son, everybody has to decide, has to figure out and process, right, how they're going to deal, right, with that dynamic, how they're going to deal with the fact that they know that they're going to be looked at differently. You know what I mean? What is that gonna? So I try to talk to my son about it, for example. I try to be honest with him without scaring him to death. That's a hard tightrope, right?
Yeah.
I want him to be prepared if he stopped, but I don't want him to be afraid of every police officer that he sees. I certainly don't want them to think that there's anything wrong with him, right? So it's, I think it's hard to talk about.
Just to let it go, and I don't know if that's the right response. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what the.
Yeah, and that's hard to do. I mean, it's particularly when it keeps happening, right? Like, so if it's like this, every now and then you have this errant person saying something crazy, you could just say, oh, I'm just gonna let that go, right? You know what I mean? But if you, if you see things like what happened to George Floyd, or if you've been stopped, several times, or you have to wonder, right, whether some teacher's comment about your kid has any, when you're always wondering, it's hard to let it go. And it can really affect how you see the world, right? And then so when you see people like, oh, you're paranoid, oh, you see racism around every corner, et cetera, and maybe it's there, but maybe it's not, but you've seen enough of it, you know what I mean, right? That you're always wondering, and that's a difficult place to be, It's more of a, are more able to let it go than others.
Thank you. Richard Conklin brings up, and we've seen recently the last few days, Confederate flags being banned by NASCAR. We've seen statues come down in different states and cities around the country. Symbolism matters, I'm supposing, a little bit here. So is it contributing to kind of a movement, or do you think it's just political fodder?
Well, this movement has been building for a while, and symbolism absolutely matters, right? Like, just like I said, conversation matters, words matter, descriptions matter, symbolism matters. And the fact that, and I might be a little controversial, but the fact that we still have Confederate symbols anywhere in our country, right? I mean, after the Civil War blows my mind. And not because, we had a class the other day, I think there's this tension with respect to Southern pride or Southern history where, and I'm, now this is just me talking, I'm sure people might take issue with this opinion, where a lot of Southerners don't want their entire history, right, to be tied up in our history with race or with slavery. And I get that, right? They want to say, there's more to us than this slavery thing. But the slavery thing was really huge, right? You know what I mean? And the Confederate flag and some of these, Confederate leaders that are memorialized in various parts of the country were part and parcel, right, of a movement to break the country in half because they couldn't let go of that particular institution. So if you, so for example, if you go to, Germany, sorry, if you go to Germany, for example, you're not gonna see any remnants of Nazi anything, right? You know what I mean? And you're gonna see these monuments to, right, this recognition of what happened, these monuments to what happened, the museums to tell you all about what happened, and all the steps that they're taking to make sure that it never happens again. So again, I think that is a tricky part of our country, right? That we still have all this symbolism, where the South wants to hold on to their heritage, but that heritage is so painful for such a big, part of our country that, have to talk about what it really symbolizes.
Gabriel, I get the sense that you want to get in on this. You put in a question, sort of a double standard of what our country would do if it was another country. You want to talk about that a second?
So to point out the fact in Germany, if you name your child Adolf, it's against the law. That's just how much they don't want you to keep with the history of trying to hold on to something. What I noticed though is, and my mom is a Southerner, so I can say when I go home to the North Carolina, I can't go down a road without at least seeing 5 Confederate flags, at least 5. So it's not unusual to see it, but I think what's really shocking is we get so angry, and by we I mean not all Americans, but as America as a whole, I have to fault us all if we don't say anything. We get so angry when you see protesters in the street arguing about how this is injustice, how this is horrible, yet in country, we would be angry. We want to invade them. We want them to be different. We want to change. We did it in World War II. Hitler, yeah, he had Holocaust camps, but he had the same concept, treating someone indifferently because of something they can't change, be it race, religion, medical disabilities, it didn't matter. He thought they were imperfect. They weren't perfect Germans. He treated them horribly, and we got so pissed off about it, we went and invaded them. We fought against them to save these people. And now that other countries are doing it to us, a lot of people are getting upset about it. And I'm just like, this is the pot calling the kettle black at this point. Why is it that we hold other people to a standard that we won't hold ourselves to? And I have a problem with that. I personally, I just think it's very disgusting that we think we're superior than others as a country just because we're a first world country and everything we say is supposed to be right, but we're not right. Yet when it comes to other countries, if they did even 1/4 of what we're doing here, we would be pissed off. We would be horrified by what's going on over there. And in history is showing.
Yeah. So Dean Brame, what about the double standard that Gabrielle described? What's your thought? Describes? What's your thought on? Is she spot on?
Well, so first of all, I've gotten to know Gabriel a little bit over the last few weeks, and I think our future's in good hands. Yes, but secondly, yes, no, I think she's absolutely spot on, and again, that goes all the way back to the founding of. That's been true since the founding of our country, right? We very high-mindedly said, we are the United States of America, and we are better than everybody else, but yet, right, we held slaves, and so we do, we do have this double standard that I think is rooted in our inability to face the past and face the truth. I think people are so quick to say, slavery was, hundreds of years ago. Why are we still talking about it? I really think that people don't see, it's hard for them to see it. It's hard for them to see, and they will write it off to a few bad apples, to to a few crazy comments. And I think that everybody wants to hold the best opinion of themselves, right? It's hard to be introspective. It's hard to hear criticism, and it's hard to. But unless we really embark on that kind of atonement, nothing's going to change. You're going to keep seeing that double standard dynamic, Gabriel.
Earl Harmon wants to bring it a little bit closer to home. He's talking about having family and friends who are claiming not to be racist, but then post things that are racist on media, social media, or even verbalize some things. What's your advice?
Yeah, and that's tough. And I would, if it were me, just continue to kind of try to call them out on it in love and try to give them examples of why, it's wrong. So to me, that's why kind of the more you know yourself, the better that you can educate yourself. You can say, I know you think that's funny, but actually here's the history of that or whatever. And I really think that having, I always tell my white friends, and they always say, what can they do? Right? You can help me explain to your friends, right? Why this is racist or what's going on here, because they'll listen to you more than they'll listen to me, right? So if I say it, I'm, angry Black woman that sees racism around the corner, but, if another white person can kind of learn the dynamics and then try to shine light on it with other people, I think that helps a lot. And it's hard, particularly if you're dealing with intergenerational dynamics when you're trying to tell your grandfather, you know what I'm saying, that he's wrong. Right. That's always tough. But I think that the more you can try to educate your family and the more you can live your life in such a way, right, that is exemplary of those values, that moves the ball.
we're just a few minutes away from having to wrap this up, but take out your crystal ball and put your lawyering hat on, and how's the George Floyd charging, prosecution, trial, whatever how do you think this is going to end? Because then my follow-up question is going to be, how are we, after what we've been through over the last couple of weeks relative to protests and then ultimately, the vandalism that went with it, how are we going to react? So first, what do you think? How's this going to play itself out?
Well, we'll see. So, I thought it was interesting that they went with more severe charges for Officer Chauvin. They, started with third-degree murder and push it up to second degree, and are trying to move with the theory that that he killed Mr. Floyd while committing a felony, that felony being assault. So, from what I saw in the video, I definitely think that there's a basis for that. My crystal ball, like, can they get one of the other officers, right, to kind of cooperate somehow in the investigation and the testimony in the trial? That would certainly help. Can they sustain the higher charges? That'll depend on, the jury pool. Will depend on who's at the table. I think that there's a greater likelihood that he'll be convicted now than it was for, back in 1992 with Rodney King, for sure. Again, to Gabriel's point about technology, that video is golden. If I were the prosecutor, I would just sit there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and that would be my case. And so hopefully they will be held accountable. If they don't, I predict a repeat of 1992. I think that would be really, really tough. If there's not at least some sort of accountability in this case. And that's always the tricky part for the prosecutor, right? Because he or she doesn't want to, you don't want to undercharge. You want to make sure that your charges hold the person accountable for what they did, but you want to be careful strategically about overcharging and getting a bad result in that regard. But my guess is that there will be guilty pleas and/or convictions in this case of some sort. But like I said, I've been proven wrong before. Maybe that's a whole part of me.
So assuming we get convictions, with all of the officers or whatever, the other three may happen with them, what's the day after look like for our society, do you think? Anything different?
So again, I think that depends on what we're talking about next year. Right. So I think it depends on what we're talking about next year. I think that would be the beginning of a healing process, right? If we have some accountability, because so many times in Freddie Gray and Eric Garner, so many times we found, we've gotten a sense that officers have kind of gotten away with it. So I think that a display of respect for George Floyd's life, right, by convicting the officer that killed him, would probably go a long way symbolically. But I still think that it depends on where our conversation goes from here, where our policy goes from here. Because again, we have seen it happen, kind of time and time again. And again, I believe that police officers are by and large well-meaning people, but I suspect there are other Derek Chauvins out there. And so maybe this will be a deterrent, right, of some sort for them. Maybe that'll be one of the other outgrowths of the conviction, that people will, kind of be less likely to be so heavy-handed. But we'll see. I wish I had a crystal ball. It'll be interesting to watch, though. So from a legal standpoint, I would admit that watching that case go through the courts would be really interesting. So pay attention, students.
Any final questions? This was fantastic.
This was really good. Thank you for putting this together. Actually, I think because as a law student and as a Black woman, this has been a lot for me to process. It's not that I haven't been through this before in my lifetime, and because this is how I live every day. But I think it's vital to educate and get that education out there, because there's a lot of people who are not used to this. There was a saying, it was like racism didn't get worse, it's just being filmed. So there's a lot of people that have been murdered. I understand we have to be politically correct and say kill, but there are a lot of Black people who have been murdered in this country, who have been lynched in this country, and it just hasn't been shined to light, or there's body cameras that have not come to light, or that have been erased, or that have been filmed, or are just sitting there. So this is not something that's new. And I think forums like this are important, not just to shine light, but also what are the solutions? What is it that we can do, not just as students, but also professors, also as deans, also as mothers, also as dads? Because this is something that it's like, when you get tired, it's what more can you do? The color of my skin is not valid. It's not in the IRAC form, the analysis, that makes no sense to me at all to this day. So thank you guys for having this, because it's really shining light, and I'm glad that I'm able to look at everybody of different nationalities and races being able to come together and educate. It's gonna be raw and people are not going to like it, but at the end of the day, you sit and you listen.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, this has been a powerful forum, and one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of weeks are folks like Aminata and Gabriel and other students and other voices just being lifting their voices and hopefully being heard. Like Aminata said, this is not an unusual conversation in our community at all, unfortunately, right? And sometimes you feel like you're knocking your head against a wall or that nobody's listening. So I love hearing these young voices, and I love that you have a platform. So I told you the other day, Aminata, keep talking, keep pushing. And keep raising your voice. And so, again, if anything comes out of that, people know, right, that we're not making this up, right? That it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Those of you who are internal to WMU-Cooley, we have another opportunity Saturday evening to get together, talk about similar issues and topics, and hopefully you're able to join us. But Professor Brame, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you've been very busy trying to get the word out around the world, literally. We also thank those who joined us today, and particularly those who are future lawyers that are with us. And we hope the conversation obviously continues, and we will have a new conversation next Thursday. We'll be featuring retired Brigadier General Associate Dean, Professor Michael McDaniel, who will discuss our current climate as it relates to Homeland Security. After this, we're going to send a short survey out. Hopefully you'll take a moment to complete it. And until our next time, please stay safe and let's take care of one another. Have a good night.